Excellent. Ron, over to you.
Okay, well, we will kick it off. Welcome. I'm Ambassador Ron Newman. Welcome to the American Academy. The Academy, for any of you who don't know, is a still small organization after 43 years. It is composed of foreign service officers, civil servants, U.S. aid officers, some non-career appointees, new military, and intelligence, all of whom have the distinction of having held senior positions more than once in various administrations, and they are therefore were practitioners who understand that even the best policy ideas often will not succeed without good implementation. And the Academy is nonprofit, it is non-governmental, it is dedicated to the idea that America deserves the best diplomacy it can get. And for that purpose, the Academy works on helping public understanding of what diplomacy is and what it's about. And that has led us to hold this discussion today. And so I'm going now to turn it over to my colleagues, Ambassador John Feely and Ambassador Yael Lempert, to carry on the discussion, which I know they have fully in hand. So, John, I know you're lurking somewhere in the ether. Feely, where are you?
John Bass, but why don't I take it by first?
Okay, I thought Feely was going to say a few words. Okay,
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Ambassador.
over to you.
I'm going to introduce this panel very briefly. I think most of the folks in this room and beaming in know the distinguished group that is before you. I'll just run through some quick bios, and then we'll turn it over to Ambassador John Bass to offer some introductory remarks and then open it up for your questions, both for those of you who are here in person and those of you who are participating online. In terms of our panel, Ambassador John Bass is a veteran diplomat and a crisis manager with 37 years of diplomatic experience and service to the nation. He most recently served in 3 of the top 5 roles in the State Department, including as state's chief operating officer and designated crisis manager. A 3-time U.S. ambassador, Ambassador Bass led U.S. missions in Afghanistan from 2017 to 2000, Turkey and Georgia. Across his career, Ambassador Bass coordinated state's response to over 36 crises, including conflicts in the Middle East, Sudan, and Haiti. And in August 2021, he returned to Kabul, Afghanistan, to lead the civilian side of the non-combatant evacuation that moved over 120,000 people to safety in 2 weeks. Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman served 27 years with the Department of State, including as the U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon in July 2006, when Hezbollah provoked war with Israel. The embassy, working with Washington agencies and 3 military commands, conducted what was then the largest non-combatant evacuation in U.S. history, moving over 15,000 Americans to safety. Ambassador Feltman has also served as U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and the UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. And in the latter capacity, he accompanied the United Nations Secretary General to Tehran in 2012, where he met Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Ambassador Alina Romanowski has over 40 years of U.S. government experience across diplomacy, defense, intelligence, and development. She most recently served as the American ambassador to Iraq, 2022 to 2024, and Kuwait, 2020 to 2022. Ambassador Romanowski held senior roles at the State Department, including as a principal deputy coordinator for counterterrorism, coordinator for U.S. assistance to Europe and Eurasia, and deputy assistant secretary in both the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. At USAID, she served as deputy assistant administrator and acting assistant administrator for the Middle East Bureau, and at the Department of Defense, she was deputy assistant secretary of defense for Near Eastern and South Asian affairs. Ambassador Elizabeth Richard served 39 years as an American diplomat, most recently as a coordinator for counterterrorism from 2023 to 2025, leading the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau and serving as a principal advisor to the Secretary of State on international counterterrorism matters. She served as a U.S. ambassador to Lebanon from 2016 to 2020. She served in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State from 2013 to 2016, and was a Deputy Chief of Mission in Sana'a, Yemen from 2010 to 2013. I am Yael Lempert. I served 28 years with the Department of State, most recently as the American ambassador to Jordan from 2023 to 2025. Prior to that, I was the acting assistant secretary and principal deputy assistant secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department from 2021 to 2023. I served as a chargé d'affaires and deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in London, the largest U.S. embassy in Europe from 2019 to 2021, and at the National Security Council from 2014 to 2017 as a special assistant to the president and senior director for the Middle East. In 2011, I was the acting deputy chief of mission in Tripoli, Libya, and I led the evacuation of the American citizen community during the Libyan Revolution. You have before you a combined 171 years of diplomatic experience, of career.
Ron
Newman, but I think would put us over the 200-year mark, and of career diplomatic professionals serving across U.S. administrations, numerous U.S. administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. And so thank you for joining us today. We have until 12 noon. Ambassador John Bass, as I mentioned, will lead us off and make some introductory remarks, and then the panel will take questions. I'll call on journalists to take questions, both those of you who are in the room, welcome, and those of you who are beaming in online. If you're in the room, please just speak up so those who are participating virtually can hear you. With that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Bass.
Thank you, Ambassador Lempert. Colleagues, good to be with you, albeit virtually today. Let me first offer a little context for what we're doing today, because I think it's quite important for all of you to understand how unusual this is. Like the U.S. military senior officers, we have a cultural norm in the Foreign Service that conditions us to be very reticent about speaking publicly as retirees about operational issues in which the department is involved. Plenty of folks talk about critique policy from retirement. Very few people will actually get under the hood in the middle of a crisis to critique that response. So the fact that we're doing this today is a reflection of how disturbed this group and many of our colleagues with similar sets of experience in war zones, in crisis operations, how disturbed we are at the breadth and the depth of the failings of the current State Department leadership. In recent weeks, the current State Department leadership, and what do I mean by that term? I mean the political appointees in positions that were either confirmed by the Senate or don't require, in some cases, Senate confirmation, but they're appointees of the president or Secretary Rubio, and a small number of career officers who have allowed themselves to be essentially politicized in their senior roles. That State Department leadership team in place today has failed at two of its most important obligations. The first of which is protecting and supporting the State Department and the wider U.S. government personnel who are assigned to our embassies and consulates overseas and their families, including small children in many of these locations. And the second thing they've failed to do is properly support American citizens caught in harm's way through no fault of their own, without any indication, in most cases, of what they'd find themselves in the middle of. These failures resulted, in my assessment, from a series of mistakes made by this leadership team. And it's a combination of mistakes of omission and commission, things they didn't do and things they did instead. Let's start with the mistakes of omission. This senior leadership team failed, first and foremost, to plan ahead, to tap into the extensive set of contingency plans that every embassy has done in coordination with our colleagues at DoD and the combatant commands to think about and accumulate the core facts that those commands would need to be able to support them in extremis situations if we had to urgently reduce a footprint or suspend operations in that embassy. They failed to think through the contingencies around ways in which a conflict with Iran could go sideways, where it might not go according to the plan as they laid it out. Iran might respond differently. And to anticipate some of those dilemmas and to make sure they had good plans in place, so that if things went sideways, they wouldn't be starting from scratch and scrambling in reactive mode to figure out what they were going to do about it. They failed to anticipate, despite decades of analysis, despite decades of collection by the intelligence community about Iran's ongoing efforts to surveil U.S. diplomatic facilities globally, and despite a record of Iran conducting asymmetric terrorist attacks against U.S. military facilities, they failed to anticipate that Iran would respond asymmetrically by attacking U.S. government diplomatic facilities and personnel and the wider U.S. American community in the region. They failed to tap into the extensive knowledge and experience of a wide range of dedicated career professionals who remain in faithful service to the nation and this administration, who wanted to do the right thing, who were ready to do that anticipatory work, but were unable to do so in the current organizational cultural climate of fear and intimidation in the State Department. And they failed to signal to American citizens explicitly that the region was becoming more dangerous and unpredictable, and to give American citizens, in most cases, fair warning that they might want to rethink whether they should continue to be present in the region, or maybe consider postponing or rerouting travel that they had planned to or through the region. Okay, so what did they do instead? Well, for starters, in preceding months before this crisis kicked off, for the better part of a year, the current department leadership enabled by design a climate of fear and intimidation across the State Department and across the Foreign Service that discouraged career professionals from taking initiative, which disabled senior officers' ability to respond quickly to developments using their best judgment and their experience, out of fear that they would lose their jobs, or that there would be other penalties to which they would be subjected. What else did they do? Well, for starters, a couple of months ago, they removed roughly 30 sitting career ambassadors and some deputy chiefs of mission, deputy ambassadors, including some from the very region that is now in the middle of a hot war, reducing the on-hand senior leadership of those embassies with deep Rolodexes, with deep contacts, including with U.S. military combatant commanders and their staff, who could rapidly problem solve and work their way through a set of contingencies and be able to respond quickly to ensure that they were doing the very best to keep their personnel, their families, American citizens safe from harm. What did they do then? Well, when the conflict kicked off, they essentially left it to embassies in the field to decide whether or not to provide any notice to adjust their operations or not. It's unclear to me whether there was any coordination with these embassies from Washington. But what resulted from that was you saw a wide range of responses across the region in terms of initial communications to embassy personnel and to American citizens, ranging from all capital letters emails saying "get out now" to radio silence. And alongside that, for days, there was no overarching communication from the department on its publicly facing websites that there was even a conflict underway, that American citizens should do the best they could under those circumstances to seek shelter or try to get themselves out of harm's way. And then the final thing that happened is senior leadership, after the conflict had begun, continued with their regular plans. If you go back and you look at the press releases from the department, both deputy secretaries, so we're talking about the number 2 and number 3 officials in the department, who normally at least one of them would be deeply involved in coordinating contingency responses and coordinating with the White House and to a certain extent with DOD. They would be making sure that the department was fulfilling these core missions. They both were on overseas travel for completely unrelated reasons. And given Secretary Rubio's dual hatting and the amount of time his obligations and responsibilities keep him at the White House, that meant that at best, you had 2 of the top 5 people in the department coordinating a response. So at a period of time when you're already behind the curve and you're scrambling to catch up, there clearly, from my view, my professional assessment, was a lack of appreciation for the seriousness of the response of the situation, and some basic prioritization about what senior officials should be focused on. And I'm confident that the choices that were made, that I just laid out, resonated with American diplomats and their families serving in harm's way, who see their leadership treating it like it's another day at the office, and they're just going to have to sort things out for the best on their own. So as a result of all this, the United States, which is usually at the forefront of supporting our citizens overseas, we are usually under regular order by every administration preceding this one, including the first Trump administration. If you think back on how well that administration, under the president's direction, evacuated people from around the world during COVID, when there were no commercial flights available. Every previous administration has been at the forefront. And now we found ourselves days into this conflict with all of our many of our European allies announcing their evacuation flights to get their citizens out of harm's way in the Gulf. And you could juxtapose those announcements, those public announcements that here's what we are doing to support you, with the absence of any information at all on the key public sites or from the key department officials who should have been talking about the conflict. So those are some pretty significant failings in my estimation, my professional judgment based on my career. And let me just conclude by noting that in anticipation of the likely highly personalized criticism that will follow us doing this, I was President Trump's ambassador to Afghanistan for over 2 years. I faithfully executed the policy and the directions of the president and the administration, which included reducing the size of Embassy Kabul by almost half, which amounted to about 3,000 people, in 4 months, in harm's way. I've spent 3 years of my career in declared war zones, and I spent another 2 years in Turkey when it was the site of regular mass casualty attacks and an attempted coup attempt, which resulted in a series of bombings within a kilometer of our embassy. as far as I know, that's 5 years more experience in war zones, in conflict zones, than anybody in senior leadership in the department. So, in anticipation of the inevitable critiques that I don't know what I'm talking about or I am being dramatic, I do know what I'm talking about. And it's with sorrow and anger that I felt compelled to lay that out for you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bass. I'm going to open it up to questions. Please.
So when I have asked the Trump administration about all this stuff, the answer I often get back is, look, we have a limited process with limited numbers of people aware of what's going on purpose. We do this because we want to avoid leaks. We don't trust the career staff. And they, in particular, in this particular case, I'm told that they feel like one of the reasons the initial stage of the war has been successful in terms of eliminating so much of Iran's leadership is because they didn't tell too many people, including our embassies in the field, and they didn't do so much prep work. Now, I know it was not exactly a secret that we could attack Iran, but at the same time, they felt like, they had the diplomatic track going, things like that. They wanted the ambiguity and they wanted the secrecy and they wanted the element of surprise. And it seems like that did work out. So what's your response to this question that this notion that if they had told too many people or did too much planning or signaled too much, that they could have undermined the war operation?
Let's start with Ambassador Feltman on that one.
Hi, good to see you. 2 points. First, just 3 days before the war started, President Trump appeared for the State of the Union address before Congress and said, daring the Democrats to stay seated, which they did, the first priority of the U.S. government is safety of American citizens. So the president said that just before the war started. Would be my first answer. But the second answer is these things are not contradictory. That as you indicated, we were moving ships. The president had been saying for weeks that he's trying diplomacy, but if diplomacy doesn't work, we may have to look at war. And that would have been the perfect key to open the door to start raising the level of warnings in the travel advisories, to authorize departure for non-emergency staff and families to leave, because you could have said, well, we're trying diplomacy. We hope diplomacy works, but we also have to prepare for all contingencies. So you start to raise the level of concern that, yes, we might be going to war, as the president said, because the purpose of all of this should be reduce the number of Americans you may have to use government resources to evacuate, reduce the number. And as a secondary point to that, yes, safety of Americans is the first priority of everything we're talking about here. But if you're also trying diplomacy, isn't this a nice pressure point to say, yeah, we're also looking at letting people leave our embassies. We're also raising the levels in the travel advisories. That adds diplomatic pressure to the negotiations that you say you want to succeed.
Other responses?
Yeah, I'd agree entirely with that. These things are not mutually inconsistent. And the other thing I want to make clear to everybody is that we do this steady planning, especially in conflict zones. And I, along with John and others here, my last 4 assignments were Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Lebanon. So that's not nothing. And what we spend our time doing when there's not a conflict is planning and making sure that everybody's on the same page and making sure we have good communications with our military folks on the other side who are also doing their planning, so that we all know, should something happen, that we have a pretty good integrated plan that is at least a starting point. And Jeff's exactly right that you can start with messaging that is short of, oh my God, leave now. There are plenty of signals that you can riff off of to say, getting a little tense in the region. The president is talking about possible conflict. You can ratchet that up slowly, which gives people the chance to do something. versus telling them after bombs are already falling, get out now and we can't help you.
Let me just add a point, having just come out of Baghdad, where we were, as many of you already know, we're taking, we were attacked both after October 7th and then again several times. And this is actually the most intense attack on our diplomatic facilities that we've seen in a couple of years. The reality is you can do all of this planning. You can begin to think of how you phase the evacuation of people. That does not in any way give away time on target, as they would say. There is a big difference between planning this and when you actually decide press the go button. And I think it's a bit insulting to think that people in the senior leadership positions at embassies who work this and who have communications all over the interagency can't keep secrets. I'm not going to debate on who's leaking what to whom, but what I will say is when it comes to this crisis, and my first crisis I ever dealt with in my long career was 1983, when I lost 7 of my colleagues in Beirut. And you remember that Time magazine of 7 people hanging off the side of the embassy. So all of us here have a lot of experience on mobilizing our embassies, our staff, and alerting American citizens and not giving away the information. So I think that communication is huge. There is both a lateral communication that goes on in embassies, but when we realize that things are getting a little bit heated, as Ambassador Bass said, there's also a vertical communication that goes on between the field and the embassy. And I probably spent a lot of time, and the last time I had to do order departure in Baghdad, speaking to Ambassador Bass and his team to reassure them that we had our stuff together, so that he didn't have to worry about the largest embassy and personnel in that region. And the largest embassy that was the best defended. The purpose of that vertical conversation was to make sure that he could also, and the NSC, the administration, could focus on those with the least defensible positions. And so it is that the whole process, the operational part of it, the training, the drilling, the contingency plans, the tweaking of the emergency action plans, the network that supports all of that many people don't see. And frankly, I'm not sure people should see, because that is a vulnerability. But the reality is it's out there and it needs to be activated. And there are ways to activate it and to work on it without giving away, as I'm going to say again, time on target. Please.
Hi, I'm Mayra from Reuters. Ambassador Bass, good to see you again. I have 2 questions, perhaps one to specifically Ambassador Bass. When he was speaking, the way he defined the culture at the State Department at the moment, a culture of intimidation and fear, and said, we don't know whether there was any communication between the embassies and 7th floor. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Feel free to give the scoops to the journalists who have attended this in person. It's like, do you know of any attempts that from the embassies that they tried to say something, but because of this culture, they were discouraged from doing so? And my second question is to everybody. When we talk to the diplomats who are on the receiving end of this, right? Like not necessarily just Gulf diplomats, but diplomats around the world, some of them tend to come out and say stuff like this. Well, we directly talk to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and sometimes we talk to directly with Trump. So who needs embassies, or I mean, not embassies, but like who needs ambassadors? So this is like leaders to leaders diplomacy, a term that Trump and Erdogan used a lot during Trump's first term. How do you counter that? Like, I mean, that sounds like an advantage, but is there a disadvantage to it? Thank you.
Ambassador Bass.
Yeah, thank you, Humaira. Thanks for your question. I don't have any specific knowledge of communications in the run-up to the conflict kicking off. But I and my fellow panelists are aware of any number of instances in which former colleagues were either fired last year, included in the reduction in force effort, and for those of you who don't know the arcana, normally when there's a reduction in force, it's merit-based or based on time and service among a group of people, and you take a percentage of that group. It's called a competition group in the government personnel arcana. Before the reduction in force, this administration essentially made each individual a competition group so that it would be able to very selectively pick who was being shown the door. And in a number of cases, people who were shown the door were people who had taken initiative in the preceding months, whether it was to continue doing the nation's business that was pressing, but they didn't ask for permission first, and somebody got their nose out of joint, even though it was run-of-the-mill stuff. In some cases, there was retribution against individuals who had been in positions within the personnel bureau, and individuals with a grievance who were now in positions of authority felt that now was their time to get retribution because they had, quote unquote, been treated unfairly. And in other cases, people who had, in those early months, tried to point out some of the downsides of a potential course of action that the administration had decided on, were deemed disloyal simply for not for refusing to implement the policy, but for pointing out some of the challenges associated with a particular course of action and making sure that leadership could make informed choices. If you go back and look at the history of U.S. foreign policy and national security mistakes, including a number of the mistakes that President Trump has identified as core mistakes in the last 25 years, you will see that they often resulted from deficits in the decision-making process where leadership did not have access to the best information and to a wide range of views about whether or not it was the best bad idea possible and whether the contingencies had been sufficiently thought through, and nonetheless, we were going to take that action. And so you would think this administration would want to ensure it was not repeating mistakes of the past administrations of which it is so critical. And yet they insisted on creating a culture that would reinforce the likelihood of exactly that happening.
And I also did, it's a little bit to answer your question, but also to make a very important point in the context, I think, of this discussion and the briefing is with all of what we see as having been the failures and the problems, I do want to emphasize how much we have to recognize our colleagues who have stepped up in very difficult circumstances to do what they have been trained to do for years, to manage the shortness of time that they were made aware of this, how immediately in many cases they went to all of those contingency plans, faced a different way of having to do evacuations because things hadn't been planned early, perhaps. So I do want to recognize and make sure everyone realizes that in as much as there were very serious issues up front, as Ambassador Bass says, our diplomats rose to the occasion because many of them out there have been through this before, had had looked at contingency plans, had looked at their emergency action plans, and just want to recognize that they did a lot, and they are continuing to do a lot within the context in which they have to operate.
I would just like to echo that point and say we have American diplomatic personnel working literally under fire at our embassies, doing heroic work, trying to support American citizen communities across the Middle East. And also our State Department experts in Washington who are working 24/7 to communicate with US citizens and organize charter flights. They're on what is called a task force that is working to try and manage this crisis. What I find unconscionable is that these personnel were not informed beforehand, were not able to execute on the extensive planning that is done across embassies around the world so that they can support American citizens before a crisis starts. And what makes this crisis so different than many of those that this panel has worked through is that it started at a time and a place of our choosing. And so it is clear that American citizens, and sadly, our American diplomats and personnel at embassies around the Middle East and their families were an afterthought, which is why you see this panel here today.
I'd like to address the second part of Mary's question if I can. There's a lot, we can have a long discussion about what our embassy is for, but for the purpose of our discussion today on evacuation, I just want to talk about what I did when I was U.S. Ambassador in Lebanon during the evacuation there, because I think it illustrates. We worked with three different commands, UCOM, CENTCOM, and TRANSCOM. We worked with a bunch of civilian authorities. We worked with the Pentagon, with the State Department, and I was calling the commanders of the command. I was calling the commanders. Condoleezza Rice was in direct contact with me about what we needed. We needed that the Israelis did not fire on the ships we were coming in, things like that. And this is not the sort of operational detail that Washington's going to know. Like, which routes are we going to pick up American citizens in the South? Now you could argue maybe you don't need an ambassador, maybe you just have a charge, a very good charge, and I think that's probably right in some cases. But you also needed to be able to get to the head of state in that country to say these are the facilities we need in order to evacuate our citizens or whatever it is you need. So there's an operational aspect to being an ambassador that goes beyond the protocol reasons. Now I would answer your question by saying we need both. We need leader-to-leader contact between countries, and we need embassies that are fully empowered to carry out the president's policies on the ground and who have the knowledge to be able to do so.
Let me see if there are any questions online.
So far, there haven't been.
All right, please.
Yeah, Rob Kramer with the Wall Street Journal. Obviously, I mean, some of the darkest chapters in American foreign policy have been attacks on embassies, Kenya, Tanzania, Beirut. Can you just talk a bit about the ongoing threat today, not just, the failure to warn embassies and families, et cetera, beforehand, but the ongoing threat to embassies today from these sustained attacks from Iranian and Iranian proxy drones and missiles, and the potential for Iran inspired lone wolf attacks whatsoever globally. What you think the State Department should be doing to help protect against that? Do you think it is doing enough now at this moment on the 19th, 3 weeks after the war, after the bungled start to that, and how big a threat that still poses? Thanks.
Let me start a little bit about trying to address that in the context of Iraq, since I literally had to face that, as you know, when you look at the dates. I think the threat that all of our embassies, but especially those embassies in those countries where there are Iranian proxies that operate and have joined either under the umbrella of the axis of resistance, or decide that, oh, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start, we're going to move against the diplomatic facilities, either as protesters or others. So you've got a whole range of threats that an embassy has to deal with. And at least speculate and plan for what happens. So specifically now you still have, drones, you have rockets, you have missiles, whether they come from Iran, whether they come from the proxy forces in Iraq, for example, you're still dealing with the same concept of having to protect the embassy. You have in Iraq in 2019, if I recall correctly, you had protesters who had massed around the embassy, and they started to come over the wall, and that was again another form of direct threat to the personnel inside the compound, inside the embassy. And going back to, I think, Ambassador Feltman's point, it is critical that the ambassador of the Chargé have a direct communication with the head of state and the head of their security. Because one aspect of keeping American personnel safe in where they are, whether they're living in neighborhoods or they're on compounds, is that you have the local host government part of your security apparatus in cases of crisis and in cases of threats. And if you don't have that, you're in a more difficult situation because you can't rely on them. We also, as an added level of protection, over many, many years, our military, our security components, the regional security offices have programs that help to train those local security forces that we need to create yet more buffer, more response, and help us do this. And so you're constantly trying to assess the situation in terms of the threat and also in terms of what you need. And the final point I would make about leadership discussion is, at the end of the day, if the host government is not responding to our request for assistance, they have to understand what the consequences are as a matter of policy. And to be able to drive home that point, you need communication not only back home with our own policymakers, because you certainly don't want to go in and talk to a leader, say, if you don't do this, XYZ is going to happen. You want to make sure that that discussion about what happens in the broader US relationship with country X, Y, or Z, if they don't help us in this crisis management, they have committed as government leaders to protect diplomatic facilities. We saw that play out in Iraq when the Iraqi security services did not assist the Swedish embassy and the Norwegian embassies in the attacks by protesters and the proxy forces. That was huge, huge, huge process mistake. And they knew it, and the way that was handled and corrected by many of the diplomatic representation was to go back to the government and say, what's the relationship here at the end of the day? And so, it's understanding the threat, it's understanding, and it's also how important it is to have those leadership, and that becomes a matter of policy. So that's the context I would put that in to answer your question.
Yeah, if I could add one to that. This gets back to, why do we need a professional, experienced diplomatic corps? How do we know that this might turn out this way? Because we have always put people in these, especially these tough posts, who have deep experience in the region, who have deep experience in the functional part of terrorism or crisis management or conflict, and who they're there as senior people because they know how to suss out what's happening. We don't always get it right, for sure, but those are the people that say, I feel like something's going on here. Let's think about this for a little bit. Now, as we saw a bunch of, half the US Navy steaming toward our Iran experts, if they were still employed, would have been saying, okay, this is how Iran has always reacted in the past. Iran has never beaten anybody in a state-on-state war. Asymmetric is how where's their biggest impact in Lebanon? Asymmetric through Hezbollah. Well, Houthis all about asymmetric. And so senior diplomats would have thought this through and thought, what are the asymmetric ways they can come in and hurt us? And for me, the US Embassy, we're in fill in the blank, and I would not exclude Europe or Japan or anywhere else. That's an asymmetric threat that I would want to be protected against. And ditto as our energy experts and everybody else, were they still there, would have been saying, watch the asymmetric impacts on energy.
Just one quick follow on, I mean, these failures you have to plan, you outlined the should haves, could haves, would haves. Do you think anything could have been different to avert what happened in the consulate in Karachi?
Potentially, yes. I don't want to say it with a certainty, but and Ambassador Richard is the expert here to talk about networks of Shia extremism and the Iranians' ability to animate and motivate like-mindeds in other countries. Our embassy in Pakistan, collectively, Mission Pakistan, certainly would have had the expertise to know if there were undercurrents of Shia extremism that was potentially going to focus on one or more of our diplomatic facilities. And that embassy team, that leadership team, certainly has the kinds of relationships with Pakistani security force leadership to have put it on their, sort of agenda in advance, and potentially to have asked for increased security if there was a credible threat stream.
A lot of you have, Vera with the Wall Street Journal as well. You've all kind of mentioned this, but in terms of the mass layoffs last year, in terms of the really deep cuts, since I know a lot of you are probably still in touch and you really understand where the biggest holes are here that haven't been replaced, or the way that a lot of this has been rearranged. We've heard a lot, obviously, about people who worked, people who had the language skills, people who were Iran experts, energy experts. I mean, in terms of what what worries you the most? Where do you see the deepest cuts that you think are affecting the current crisis, the ability to respond?
I think one of the most tragic cuts and the ones that are most have had the largest impact is on leadership. I was just going to point out that all of us were in the region. We had to do the same thing at the same time, and the fact that I could call Ambassador Lempert, Ambassador Richard, we think alike. We've had the experience. We've been in the region. We shortcut a lot of stuff to say, what's going on? What do you know? Can you do this? How is this going to work? We had experience and leadership from Ambassador Feltman and others. And the fact that the cadre of senior people with lots of experience through many crises, as I said, 1983, I first worked with you in Yemen. Right. It's invaluable, and it's not something you can stay in a classroom. We can put up tons of slides, which we all love to do. The Pentagon, the State Department, you can see Ambassador Bass smiling about how you do this. Make sure you call so-and-so, here's this and that. But it's living it in the moment. It's on the job training. And you can't replace that. And that's what is missing in crises and in regions that we know have crises. They're every single time they're different, and in some aspects they're the same. But the fact that we've all been through this many times, and our expertise, even as retirees, doesn't match what's out there right now, and should be drawn on. They can finally make decisions that are different. We've all been through that. We've all worked with the very different administrations. But to think that our expertise isn't valued, and this is not a complaint, it's an observation. You can't get the stuff by reading books. You got to be there.
If I could just quickly jump in, having been in the leadership positions in Washington, when Ambassadors Lempert and Romanowski were in the field, they embodied precisely what we think of in terms of servant leadership. Little bit of vision, certain amount of direction, and then the rest of it figuring out how to support all of their team to get the job done. And it was very easy for me, in the middle of any number of crises impacting both of their missions, to pick up the phone, I never had to say to them, hey, are you thinking about, you should do the following. It was always, what are you already doing? Because I know you're already on top of it. And what support do you need from Washington to be effective? And it's not at all dissimilar from the relationship in the military between the combatant command that's right on the X, the supported command, and the rest of the military establishment looking for ways to support those folks who are right in the thick of it. The other piece of expertise that I would just quickly note that's missing is decades of experience on highly technical issues related to missile technology and the proliferation of that expertise, how to build missiles, precision guided, medium range or intercontinental ballistic missiles, and related systems. And our ability to evaluate Iran's remaining capacity, or how quickly it can mobilize to restore that capacity, is substantially less than it was a year ago.
So we have just a few minutes left before noon. So why don't we take the remaining questions and then we can answer them as a group. So please.
Kim Dozier, CNN analyst. Just wanted to, at the risk of double tapping this issue, what do you think the advice is the president is getting regarding how this war might go forward, with him considering things like putting troops in Bab el-Mandab, et cetera? With the chilling effect of the previous firings, do you think people are telling him asymmetrically the kind of threat Iran will likely represent 6 months from now, 1 year from now?
Please.
That was essentially something like what I was going to ask, which is, the president said this week that nobody could have anticipated the Iranian response. What does it say about the policy process, or the lack of a policy process, that seems to either think that, or at least says it?
You mentioned the Pentagon a few times. The president seems to like the military. The military, Pentagon, whatever, sometimes they've thrown the State Department under the bus. I remember after Afghanistan and the mess there, they really went out of their way to blame the State Department for absolutely everything that got screwed up. And I don't know if it all got published, but that is definitely what they were doing. And some of it was legit and some of it was just not. But I do have to wonder, are people at the State Department at least turning to their friends or frenemies or contacts inside the US military and being like, hey guys, can you maybe tell the president or, whoever's running this show that they should probably devote a little more attention to the diplomatic side of things and letting them know what to do, because it can't just be all about us. Is there anything like that happening?
Again, I go back to my experience, and I'm one of the few diplomats who've been deep in the bowels of 4 different agencies in my career. There is the very formal way of getting the information you need in a crisis, and that is because the undersecretary at the State Department counterpart is the Undersecretary of Defense for policy, and there is a requirement and there is a necessity to speak at the same level, and that happens. But at the same time, as you go through your career, there is this recognition that you can't do your job in any one of these agencies without actually having contacts and good relationships there, so that when you are in a crisis or you want to know what's going on, you can call on somebody and say, hey, what are you hearing about this? And also, hey, this is our view. Can you find, do you have opportunities to get this more informally? There's a formal process and an informal. You have to have both of them working at the same time. I can't speak to right now who's talking to whom and who gets to talk to the president. I mean, I'm not going to speculate on that, but you don't have to go to the intelligence community to see what people are the assessments that people were making. This town is full of think tanks And I'm sure if you don't have to go very deeply in the archives to find out that at least the contingency, the predictions, the recommendations, the speculation included the asymmetric, the reactions of what the Iranians are doing in response to a conflict, either started by the Israelis or with the United States. This is not, as someone said to me, then rocket science. So how they missed that or how they excluded it, maybe that's part of the decision making, but in my mind, to say that they didn't know about it, I don't know how that's possible. Not in this town.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this one? All right. I think we've hit 12 noon. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're available to answer a few more questions as you leave, if there aren't any. Thank you. Thank you to our panel.